how did they know Johnny was going to be alone that morning? And I heard something in court that I'd never heard before, anywhere. Paul Benassi straightened up in the chair, and he said, well, they made prior arrangements with Johnny's father. I was blown away.
Well, see, that,
I about fell off my chair in the courtroom.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yep. And that's important, and that can all go in this section.
Yeah, I have a note on it.
Yeah.
On the father.
Were you surprised when you heard that in court?
I already did.
Huh? You already had heard that?
I have a note. Why? I have a note on that right here. I was going to ask you about that. Why the father? Weren't you suspicious when the father, in 13 years, the only time he never went with Johnny was that morning?
13 months.
13 months. Yeah.
Yeah, I was. Rusty, how did you know that John... Oh, wait a minute.
Being in the circles.
I know. I remember what you told me in DeCamp's office. Do you remember? Because you also said it on a radio program.
No.
And I've got the tape.
You're lucky to have the tape, because he never got me one.
What about soda? We didn't.
I've got the tape put away.
We didn't mention Soda's name either.
No, we didn't talk about Soda, but we can.
Yeah.
Rusty, when he was showing a picture of John Gosch with no labels on it or anything in DeCamp's office, remember?
Picked it out.
George pulled out the picture,
Mm-hmm.
and he says, do you know this guy? And he held up John Gosch's picture. And Rusty says, yeah, I met him in Larry King's office.
He was at Larry's office.
He was over at Mac, and at the Max, and he was also at Larry King's office.
Yeah.
What? Karen Burns told me that the very first time she ever laid eyes on John Gosch, she suspected him.
Yeah, your husband.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Was he participating in all the parties, too? Did he go to those in Nebraska? Did you ever see one?
That many of the parties. I tried to avoid those like the
Mm-hmm.
plague.
But you know, in your circle of talking to people, did you ever hear of him going to those parties? Because, see, he was gone all the time, Rusty.
Yeah.
He'd leave on Sunday morning. He wouldn't get back till Saturday night.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would get his laundry done, pack up, and he'd leave again. He would never tell me where he was staying. I never had a phone number or an itinerary
Part of the network.
of where to reach him.
Yeah. Have we got new film in there? Is it running?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Okay, all right.
Hey, that's the best stuff.
Let's go with it. Go.
I figured we got this much tonight.
Okay. In 1999, John DeCamp called me and asked me if I would come to Omaha, Nebraska.
Start again.
In 1999, John DeCamp called me and asked me if I would come to Lincoln, Nebraska to testify in a federal court hearing for Paul Benassi. Paul Benassi was going to file charges against Larry King for his own abuse that he received at the hands of Larry King. It would be one of the first times the victim was able to do this in a federal court. I testified about Johnny's story, what happened, but then the most interesting thing started to develop when Paul testified. The judge asked Paul to relate the entire story about Johnny's kidnapping. Paul told every detail of how Johnny was kidnapped, why, for what purpose, the fact that he was taken to Sioux City, then sold into this ring. The judge then asked Paul, how did the kidnappers know Johnny Gosch would be alone that morning on the paper route? And Paul Benassi sat straight up in the chair. He looked at the judge and he said, prior arrangements were made with Johnny's father to be sure that Johnny would be alone on the route that morning. I was sitting in the courtroom. I had never heard this before in all the years of the investigation, and I about fainted. The other key question that the judge asked Paul Benassi was, why did they pick Johnny? What did they want him for when there's so many runaways to choose from? And Paul Benassi said, Johnny fit the criteria of what they were looking for in a victim. someone to use in this manner. After the judge ruled in favor of Paul Benassi in this federal court ruling by Judge Erbaum, which awarded Paul Benassi damages in the amount of $1 million, the judge also stated in court that he believed that Paul Benassi was telling the truth about his own abuse and that of the kidnapping of my son Johnny. To me, this meant new information and a new focus for the investigation. I traveled back to Des Moines and I made an appointment with the police department and the county attorney. I presented them with the information about the federal court ruling, Paul Benassi's testimony about Johnny's kidnapping, and they looked at me and they said, well, I'm sorry. We simply do not accept Judge Erbaum's ruling. We do not feel Paul Benassi is credible despite what the judge has said. I then went to the new governor of Iowa, Governor Tom Vilsack, who had taken office several months before. I approached him because I know he has the power to force the law enforcement to act. Tom Vilsack, Iowa's governor, stated that neither kidnapping of Johnny or Eugene Martin, the two newspaper boys from Des Moines that are missing, were any of his concern, and that I should take up my problems with the Department of Public Safety. That's the message that he gave me. He was not concerned. In Iowa, the Department of Public Safety does a lot of things. They place traffic lights at busy street corners. They do lots of other things, but they don't do kidnapped children. But the governor wasn't interested. This is, again, the reaction that I got when the evidence was given to these men. I would ask the question again, is it utter stupidity? Do they not understand how to do an investigation? Is this investigation, these crimes, so far out of their league, they don't know what to do? Are they protecting someone who is high up in our government? Or are they involved themselves? Or is it all four? It's a multiple choice question. Think about it and you choose. What has happened here is a travesty. It's a horrible miscarriage of justice. And the tragedy of two young boys being ripped off the streets should never have been allowed to happen. And even though that it did, there should have been a prior or much better investigation after this new evidence, especially after this new evidence was reported.
Did the police ever investigate the Martin case, Martin kidnapping?
When Eugene Martin was kidnapped in 1984, they
this was
brought...
6 months after Johnny.
No, it was 2 years.
2 years, okay, start again.
2 years after my son was kidnapped in 1984, Eugene Martin, another paper carrier, was kidnapped off the streets of Des Moines. At that kidnapping, the FBI they were called in. They brought in 22 agents from Quantico, Virginia, to investigate the case, something they didn't do for Johnny. They did aerial searches, which they wouldn't do for Johnny. They brought in dog teams, which they didn't do for Johnny. All of the things that should have been proper investigation for Johnny and wasn't done, they did do for the Martin boy. I don't understand why there would be such a difference, except that there was a public outcry. The citizens of Iowa raised the roof at two kids being kidnapped. When it was just my son, there was not that public outcry, and I don't understand why. A few months before Paul Benassi was kidnapped, or before Eugene Martin was kidnapped, a man called me by the name of Sam Soda.
Excuse me, go back. Start again, say a few months before Johnny.
A few months before Johnny was kidnapped, a man by the name of Sam Soda, a private investigator locally, called me. He wanted to meet, and he said that he had information that there was going to be a second kidnapping in Des Moines. When I asked him where, how did he know this? He wouldn't reveal his sources, but he told me that it would be the second weekend in August of 1984, that it would be the south side of Des Moines, and it would be another paperboy. And I said, well, why are you telling me? And he said, so I could go to the authorities. When I asked Sam Soda how he knew this information about a second kidnapping, he wouldn't reveal his sources, but he told me that he wanted me to go to the authorities and tell them. I had made a tape recording of that conversation. So I went to the Des Moines Police Department and wanted to play my tape for them, and they laughed at me, and they sort of patted me on the head and sent me out the door. I then went to the TV stations and talked to the managers of each of the TV stations here in Des Moines and told them about it. They at least listened, but they didn't want to hear my tape. I also then talked to Frank Santiago of the Des Moines Register, and I told him about this whole possibility of another kidnapping. At that point, I was to fly to Washington, D.C. to testify before the Senate hearings. I went, testified in Washington, and flew home. The next day, 2020, came to Des Moines to film Johnny's story. This was now August of 1984. Karen Burns, the producer, was in our home. After we did the interviews, I told her about this prediction of a second kidnapping. And I told her about Sam Soda, and I let her listen to the tape recording. And she said, well, what have you done about this? And I told her I went to the police, I went to the press, they all know about it. She says, I think I'll stay the night. So the film crew flew back to New York. Karen stayed in Des Moines. The next morning, my phone rang, and...
Okay, let's start with the next morning. You received that phone call.
The next morning, the next morning, our phone rang early, and it was the TV reporter from Channel 5, which is our ABC station in Des Moines, and he was telling me that, yes, Mrs. Gosch, there's been another kidnapping, just like you said it would happen. And he was just out of breath. He was a real young kid. And I said to him, how do you know it's a kidnapping? He says, I just heard it. Hello? Hi? I'm fine.
Okay.
The next morning, my phone rang, and it was a reporter from Channel 5, our ABC station, and he starts out by saying, Mrs. Gosch, there's been another kidnapping, just like you said was going to happen, just exactly the way you said it would happen. The south side of Des Moines, another paper boy. He said, the FBI's been called in. And I said, how do you know all this? He said, well, it was on the police scanners, and they're treating it as a kidnapping right away. So I thanked him, and that was the end of it. I called Karen Burns at the Marriott Hotel. I woke her up, and I said, Karen, it's just happened. There's been another kidnapping, just as the man told me. Call and get your own film crew back here from New York. Don't use the locals on this one. So Karen called New York. They got a film crew on a plane, and by about 9 o'clock, they were into Des Moines. They blasted into the Des Moines police station with a microphone in her hand, and they shoved it in the face of the police chief, and they said, are you going to do aerial searches for this boy? They didn't for Johnny Gosch. Are you calling in the FBI? They didn't for Johnny Gosch. Are you bringing in canine teams? They wouldn't for Johnny Gosch. And they put the police chief on the spot, and this went on national television.